All right. It's our seventh lecture, interview methods. So today, for 2 hours, we're going to be talking about methods. How do we actually do and think about doing some of what we've been talking about? So ethnography, and then what does ethnography actually entail? What does ethnography include? And as usual, linguistic anthropologists have taken this idea of the interview and have taken what you might call a critical approach to it. So throughout the lecture today, we're going to be looking at the fact that there's no doubt that interviews are a valuable thing to do, but also that we should be wary of some ideas circulating in society about interviews and their purpose. And to start, we would start with a pretty classic reading. How do I make that go away? It's here too. Sorry. How do I make this go away? All right. So Learning How to Ask is a book by Charles Briggs. Charles Briggs is older than I am, and he is a professor at University of California at Berkeley, in what has become a classic text, and it really is a classic text. It's quite short and a short read, and it made quite a punch in its day. In its day, meaning before a lot of us in the room were probably born, 1986. Briggs outlined some of the ways that interviews have been ideologized in social science research. In other words, we've been talking about ideologies of language. Briggs talked about the ideologies of interviews, right? What do we think interviews accomplish? What do we think interviews involve? And who is we? We is people living in what I would say is a media-saturated world where interviews and interviewing has become such a pervasive aspect of a lot of media communication, especially anything that pretends to realism, like documentary, the news. Does the news pretend to realism? Yes, maybe, I don't know, that's debatable. All right, that is to say, Briggs made explicit what people think an interview accomplishes. This is especially important to do, given that social science research almost always includes interviewing. Popular ideologies of interviewing, and there are more. This is a very small list. Interviews allow researchers, and think to yourself as we go over these, do these ring true to you? Interviews allow researchers to identify aspects of the world, making it possible to focus on a topic. That's one thing I think that a lot of people think that interviews allow. Interviews allow researchers to bring out what is in a person's head, their thoughts. Aspects of the world are revealed in descriptions. So the world is actually revealed in how we describe it. Interviews maximize an economy of speech, whereby researcher and respondent implicitly agree to abide by the same conversational rules and routines. That's another ideology of interviews. And finally, the conversational routines that the respondent and researcher are familiar with are epiphenomenal. In other words, they're in the background, they don't matter. Thus, they can be ignored as inconsequential because the real issue is the information at hand. So if you've ever done interviews, do you even feel the compulsion that what really you're after is the target, and anything else you sift out and ignore? Briggs asks us to consider interviews themselves as a particular kind of communicative event. In other words, what Briggs does is he treats the interview itself as ethnographic. What is going on in an interview, and how might we, as linguistic anthropologists, as social science researchers, how might we approach the interview like we would approach any other communicative event? And he argues speakers take up very particular dispositions to one another, right? Very particular dispositions and to ongoing interaction. An interviewer asks questions of a respondent, and the respondent answers. Of course, interviews are not see later in this class period. We're going to complicate this quite a bit. Questions tend to put the focus outside of the interview and what is currently happening. So imagine you're there with your interviewee. That's one event happening. But what you're actually after is probably not that. It's probably somewhere else in another space and time. Answers are meant to describe aspects of the world. Respondents can be judged as reliable or unreliable, as truthful or untrustworthy. And any routines and functions of speech and interaction that come from the world of the respondent, not in keeping with the constitution of the interview outlined here, are likely to either be misunderstood or deemed irrelevant to the purpose at hand. So if people do something other than simply describing what you're after, you ignore it. Or perhaps you even decide it's disobedience or uninformed, or that the person is being inattentive. Briggs asks us to consider the transition from small talk to the interview that so often occurs in the course of an interview. In other words, Briggs is now saying in this part of his book that the interview actually involves at least two, usually three, at least. Sometimes in the book he argues hundreds of discrete events where the construction of who is doing what at what time and to what purpose shifts radically, right? So first, Briggs says, he argues that kind of the most basic form of the interview is probably involving three such discrete events. The interviewer engages in small talk, and these are actually in sequence. So at the beginning of the interviewer engages in small talk. How are you? And notice, that's actually a question about the communication happening at that time and place. But notice the interviewer initiates the interview. Now tell me about. Now you've shifted the focus outside of the immediate speech context, and the context has shifted to another time and place. Now you're expecting your respondent to tell you about something else at another time. Then a return at the end. The interviewer engages in small talk. So we're back to small talk, and notice what happens. It's good to see you. I appreciate your letting me interview you again, right? Notice the pronouns. How are you? Now tell me about, right? It's good to see you. I appreciate your letting me interview you again. So in the first and the third, the pronouns are about the interviewer and the respondent. In the second, it's really about the respondent having to take on the responsibility of satisfying the interviewer's demands, right? All right, and what doesn't happen here? And Briggs says this is so often the case. Does the interviewee initiate anything? Nothing. So just think to yourself, what is the focus of each of these three sections? What does each section accomplish? Does the relationship between the interviewer and the respondent shift between sections, and how? And of course, you can ask, in the first and third moment, is the concern all that pressing and sincere? Or is the real thing that you're after in the middle? Is this, like a friend of mine calls it, poop sandwich? All right, so, contemplate those things. And what would you say you're trying to accomplish in that first line? Lots of things. Opening up the interview, breaking the ice. That's a great metaphor we often use. Establishing a relationship. Are we doing it very well? How do you usually establish relationships with people? Over long periods of time. Here you do it in the course of, how are you? Is that even 3 seconds? 2 seconds? Yes, definitely you're establishing roles. I'm asking the questions and you are answering them, right? Absolutely. In the middle, what are you trying to accomplish? I love it. That is a nice verb that Briggs would be delighted with. Extraction, right? Yes, absolutely. Any indications of that? Yes, now tell me about it. Is that how you talk to your friends? Right. And now, what is that word about? Now.
Now we're done with the small talk. Let's begin.
Small talk is over. Let's shift to the stuff at hand. Yes. And then it's good to see you. Is it good to see you, or was it good to get the stuff in the middle? Right? I appreciate your letting me interview you again. I really appreciate it. All right. Linguistic anthropologist considers small talk and interview to be names for speech events, right? These names are important to consider when engaging in ethnographic fieldwork because they can circulate widely. In other words, a lot of people know about them. Also, people engaged in interaction, and not only do they know about them, they use them to interpret what's happening in the world. People engaged in interaction might have more or less familiarity and experience with them. So are these universal? They circulate widely, but does everyone know how to participate in an interview? Have you ever conducted an interview that just went horribly wrong? Great. And not because of any technical glitch, but because Maybe the person you're interviewing is not familiar with any of what we've been talking about. Thus, they can thus exhibit behavior that will itself provide cues about their social history and whether and how they have engaged in the speech event.
Last point, and also one point from the previous slides are contradictory, because there was a slide that said that any interactions from the respondent that does not fit into the outline of the interview should be avoided, or should not be considered as part of the interview. But then that also may reveal to us their dispositions, and I think they're also important to consider and think about.
No question, no question. Yes, two different things. So Briggs is mapping out the ideology of what an interview is supposed to accomplish. Here we're looking at what is actually happening, right? Fascinatingly enough, interview has become so salient in our world. I was at Delhi University just a few weeks ago talking to students, and they were saying we don't really use English in our lives ever, except in class and in interviews. And if we can't use English in an interview properly, we won't get a job. So do you see what I mean? There's the idea of what is required in an interview, and then the effects of what performance in an interview entails. And you're absolutely right. We should pay attention to the shift that is necessary, what is demanded of you in order to have this knowledge, and then the consequences of the lack of that knowledge in the world. We should also pay attention to other things too. In the purpose of small talk, to establish the truth by way of, linguistic anthropologists thus put particular speech events in a wider set of possibilities. They put speech events in ethnographic contexts in which the speech event might or might not be important or even salient. And of course, our point is that interviews are important. They become, even since Briggs's time, an ever increasingly salient speech event in our world. These are just questions to think about. Is the purpose of small talk to establish the truth by way of a description of the world? So here we're talking about what is the function of a speech event? What is the purpose of it? What can I just do? Can I just get rid of it? Cool. How about if I do that? Okay. All right. So is the purpose of small talk to establish the truth by way of a description of the world? Is it? Is how the person and how they're feeling really a truth conditional that we're really all that worried about? And is the purpose of interviews to get to know someone better? Is it? I really want to be your friend. Let's do an interview. Speech events in Cordoba, New Mexico. So in order to show that interview is hardly a universal speech event, Charles Briggs reflects on time he spent in a pretty small town in the United States state of New Mexico. Yeah, it's just making me. It's okay? Okay. Let's try it again. Sorry if I'll pull it away if it makes that sound. In order to show that the interview is a specific speech event, Briggs offers an analysis of speech events in Cordoba, New Mexico. Actually, that should be a V, which is produced as a V, apologies, in the southwestern USA. The small community of 700 people are largely descendants of Spanish and Mexican settlers. In fact, it used to be Mexico during the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Though their ancestry includes Native American elements, so there's a lot of Native American DNA in these people, they considered themselves to be culturally Hispanic. They would never call themselves Native, and Native, just like in India, is a heavily loaded and overdetermined identity, as all identities are. All right. So in our interaction, Lupe is Linda's grandmother. Ben is Lupe's oldest son and Linda's uncle. Maria is Lupe's youngest child and Linda's aunt. Linda's parents are also present in the background. And the scene is Maria is pulling Linda's leg when Lupe tells her to stop. Then, on next slide, Ben charges Linda, meaning he runs toward her and pulls on her leg. So it's a typical family scene. So Ben says, no, tell her dog's braids. Lupe says, leave her alone, I'm telling you. So Ben rushes, pulls her leg, screams at her. Grandmother says, leave her alone, I'm telling you. Ben says, dog's braids, tell her. Linda says, Ben says, dog's braids, tell her. Linda says, Mia, which Briggs doesn't quite understand. That's why the brackets. And he never does get anyone to be able to translate it. Ben says, dog's braids, that's good. And here, dog's braids is insulting. It's like an insult. So, what in the world is going on here? Briggs discusses 3 premises that help to make sense of what is happening in this transcription. And in fact, do you understand much about what is happening here? Not too much, right? This is why we need ethnography to complement a transcription. It's often that from a transcription itself, we don't really understand very much. So what happened to interviews being the words that describe events in the world? And that those are what we're after and that's what's valuable. Here is an interview happening. No. Babies are innocent. This is one premise. They cannot be blamed for behavior, but they are also very vulnerable to supernatural attack, right? Babies are also not just innocent, they're defenseless, especially when expressing joy or fear. So that ups the ante, as it were. Here, Ben, by grabbing her leg, is making the baby fearful and emotional. And that is a risk. And Granny knows it. This explains Granny, or Lupe's, ambivalence. She enjoys the game and watching it, but ultimately ends the game, right? Oldest boys bear special responsibilities in the family. This explains Ben's social role in the teasing, but also Lupe's more forceful command to him. She doesn't chastise Linda, right, her granddaughter, so much for teasing her sister. She really chastises Ben in a way that is so forceful, it actually stops the teasing. He's gone just enough. She doesn't want for him to go too far. One should be encouraged to fight one's own battles and should not be babied. This is our third premise that helps us to understand maybe what's going on in this transcription. This explains why Lupe says, do you want me to pull on your Indian braids? And Indian braids is an insult here. As if she is Linda teasing Maria. She is, in effect, encouraging Linda to tease back and thus defend herself, right? The baby's too young. The baby is not going to be able to understand the words that Granny is telling her. But she is preparing the baby in a way, right, to fight back, to actually resist. So the critiques of Charles Briggs are valuable. Interviews are often understood as if everyone is familiar with them, everyone knows how to engage in them, and information about the world is accessible through them. Well, it is very important that researchers keep these lessons in mind. Recent scholarship, much more recent, I would say, maybe 20 years more recent, by Sabina Perino, for example, has begun to use Briggs's insights to think about what happens within the activity of the interview, right? And she finds that what typically happens within the confines of an interview is a bit more complex than Briggs ever, let's say, gave attention to. And that's for a reason. Briggs was being strategic. Briggs really wanted to take this idea of the interview and deconstruct it to his own rhetorical advantage. Let's be honest. And I think he would acknowledge that. For example, you have to get your book published. For example, the idea that an interviewer asks the questions and the interviewee answers with the information requested is impossibly simplistic. Impossibly. This cannot happen. In the real world, I think we'd be hard pressed to even write a scenario, invent a scenario where things were this easy. There's always a sort of what Irving Goffman called footwork, right? Involved, or footing involved in interaction, where our social roles have to be established in some way, or at least, if not established, taken for granted. Consider the interview excerpt from research here at IIT-GN. Praji is the interviewer, Geeta, Arvind, and Ruhani are the interviewees. Questions about this as we read it. Does Praji ask all of the questions? Is Praji, for example, the undenied controller of everything that happens in the interview, as Briggs intimates in his very simple tripartite example, right? Or do other people ask questions? In other words, do other people take on the role, perhaps, of interviewer during the interview? What does Arvind do that no one else seems to, right? And can we actually learn from that? What does Ruhani do that no one else seems to? And can we actually learn from that? How does Arvind respond in the end, right? And what does that tell us about the way that he has, let's say, been treated? Crudely, we'll just gloss it, has been treated in the interview. All right, Praji says, so where are you guys from? Question? Absolutely. Geeta says, I'm from UP. Praji says, okay, where in UP? Geeta says, Aligarh. Arvind says, I'm from Rajasthan. Ruhani says, Rajasthan means? Wait, I thought Praji was doing the interview. What is Ruhani doing asking the questions? Arvind says, yeah. Well, that's quite an answer. Ruhani says, your mother tongue is different, no? Arvind should say, Praji is doing the interview. What's it to you? Could he say that? Instead, he says, my mother tongue is Hindi. Most usually, most of the people in my area, they speak Marwari. But actually, I am born and brought up in ये Jaipur, तो वहाँ पे Hindi, I am not fluent in my dialect, Marwari. So one answer is Aligarh, and one answer is my mother tongue is Hindi. Most usually, most of the people in my area, they speak Marwari. But actually, I am born and brought up in this Jaipur, to wahan pe, there, Hindi. I am not fluent in my dialect, Marwari. How would you enter that answer into your spreadsheet? Geeta, you would just put UP, Aligarh, Arvind, Rajasthan, and then you would have a whole string where during his answer, what does he do? He's specified where he's from. How does he do it? Yeah, he hasn't. What has he done? Yeah, is his answer a lot more maybe interesting than Geeta's? And what about all the pronouns? People in my area? Who asked about that? I don't care about the people in your area. I asked you a question. We don't treat interviewees like that, do we? Some people do. Sure, unstructured. What does unstructured mean? I love that. It doesn't have a structure, is how some people would answer. How would other people answer? It's very conversational. Another way of saying that is it that you actually let people talk. Is that fair?
So I think the unstructured interviews are basically you have a certain idea that what you want from your interviewers, and then interviewee, and then you let them go with the flow. Like you
Go
tell
with
them
the
a
flow.
word, and then they'll tell you, and then this
That's beautiful. You let them go with the flow. Is that the opposite of what's happened to Arvind here? Has Ruhani let him go with the flow?
Praji has certain.
Praji has. What has Ruhani done?
She has.
Pulling him in another narrative.
She's
another direction.
interrupted him. She's told him,
It's more of a digression.
you're a
rather than-
problem. You're a weirdo, perhaps? No? Your mother tongue is different, no? You don't know your own mother tongue. Let's keep that in mind as we go on in the interview and see what Arvind does at the end, right? Is that possible? So my only point, you're very right, unstructured interview, but let's actually, this is linguistic anthropology, let's actually look at what's happening in the moment rather than using our ideologies of interviews to interpret what's happening, right? So going with the flow is an unstructured interview, no question, but is that what's happening here? Or are we complicating that idea? Praji seems to be doing that, but Ruhani, who's not even an interviewer, is she going with the flow? Or letting basically Arvind go with the flow? No way. I don't think so. What else is interesting about his response? We don't want to fetishize linguistic difference. We don't, but it is there. Who up till this point in the interview has not spoken any other code than English? Do you think there's a reason that Hindi is suddenly here? Yeah. Defensive.
I don't know, maybe like he wants to
When I
explain.
get defensive, I'm a lot ruder than this.
No, no, I mean, he tries to like put his position in a better way because she's constantly trying to manipulate the answer. Trying to.
You bet. You bet. So the Hindi here seems, we don't know what it is. We don't know what it is initially, but it seems to be oriented to something, right? And perhaps it's oriented to what Ruhani has done. Perhaps, right? And does it seem related to positioning, place? Where am I from? And what does that have to do with anything? Perhaps? And what doesn't come in here? Obviously, we don't hear any Marwari, right? Praji says, so your mother tongue, you did not speak? Uh-oh. Going with the flow? Or is she joining Ruhani's crusade? Arvind says, Marwari nahi hota hai. Hamare papa thoda bolte hain, mama nahi. I don't speak Marwari, dad speaks a little, mom does not. Right? So fascinatingly enough, mother tongue is about what? Do we learn something about mother tongue here? Or at least, let's say, Arvind's understanding of mother tongue here. What are the relevant elements to mother tongue?
He's hinting towards what his mother may speak.
Here, I think he's saying mama, meaning mother. He's not using the, he's not, but yes, mama is, it's definitely maternal uncle. But here he's saying mama like, yeah, mama. Yes, mama versus mama. Yes, definitely. Oh yes, we haven't gotten there yet. Yes, absolutely. And why is this almost totally in Hindi? Hindi is his first language or mother tongue? Yes. Hindi is his mother tongue, right? And is he saying without saying, you understand? Is he indicating without saying, you're not listening to me? Hindi is my mother tongue, right? First he said it. He articulated it as a description of the world. Now he's performing it. Does that make sense? He is performing that Hindi is his mother tongue. And he's doing it when the question was asked in English. English, right? Praji says, okay, then you speak Hindi. Ruhani says, then you should learn, no? You should learn your mother tongue. She didn't say it like that. She said, she did say, then you should learn, no? You should learn your mother tongue. She did say it like that. Yes. I was trying to emphasize, what is she doing here? No, she's certainly not listening to Arvind. You bet. Your mother tongue is not Hindi. It is
Marwari. And you
Marwari.
should learn your mother tongue as
And you
everybody
should
else
learn
does.
it. She's rejecting his answer. What else is she doing?
There's no inquiry at her end anymore. She just wants her pre-owned ideas either to be corroborated or she's not accepting them at all.
And
She's
isn't,
not- She's not coming with a sense of inquiry that I want to know it from you. So.
and is that a little ironic? The person who's
It
offered
is
the
only
most,
ironic.
the person who's offered the most about themselves, right? Has been schooled. And let's say the person who has actually described himself or themselves in another setting and even used all sorts of complicated chronological shifts between what he describes and the setting that is involved. He offers an elaboration, right? He even switches. He has offered so much complexity here. And yet, no. So Urban responds, it's about mother tongue, not father tongue. My father speaks Marwari, right? What is this about?
It's been clear from the starting that my mother tongue is Hindi and I am fluent in Hindi.
Definitely.
His father speaks Marwari because he's from that region. So he's bringing the interview back to the point of mother. The interview is about mother.
He's once again saying, Marwari, I don't speak. Someone in my family does. It is associated with my area, but I don't consider it my mother tongue. He's also saying,
He's directly relating the term with the literal meaning of it. I mean, the literal meaning, he's correlating mother tongue with his mother, very direct.
yes. And why the literalness of this last? I like that word. He's being very literal here. Does that have any rhetorical effect?
He was being constantly told that he doesn't speak his mother tongue, so he's trying to assert that it's not his mother tongue.
Yes. Is it as if he's saying, I have to be this literal because
You don't get my.
you don't get it? Right? Beautiful. So, does Praji ask all of the questions? Is Praji even in control of this interview? Which is a good thing. Do we always want to be in control of an interview? I often, it's a terrible, maybe even dishonest tactic, but one of my favorite things to do in an interview is to lose control as quickly as possible on purpose. What does Arvind do that no one else seems to? Lots of things, right? Lots and lots of things. He code switches. He actually answers follow-up questions. Nobody else does that. What else does he do?
In a way that gives us more information.
Yeah, he beautifully put. He tells us something about mother tongue we didn't already know, without telling us, right? He actually performed something about mother tongue we didn't already know. And in the end, very politely, he resists, right? Very, very politely, and says, so unable do you seem to be to understand what I'm saying that I have to be very, very literal, almost comically literal about what mother tongue is. And to be honest, he giggles a bit in this last line. Yes.
And it's very powerful.
Lovely. Where do you go from here? If they ask again, can you imagine? All right. So we can ask generally about really anything. Are the roles interviewer and interviewee sufficient to understand what is happening in the interview with Praji, Geeta, Arvind, and Ruhani? Do we just have two interviewers here? Or do we need more complex categories? Is interviewer sufficient? How many people think, oh, I would just call Praji and Ruhani interviewers? How many people think we need another category? Right? An interviewee? Do Ruhani and Arvind seem like they're in the same category? They're just both interviewees. Do we lose a lot if we simply call them that? I love that. What if we just call them all participants? Do we lose even more about the dynamics? What about poor Geeta? What do we call her? Sensible? Joke, terrible joke, right? So the point is that these are totally insufficient categories for understanding what is happening in this transcript. And also, the people in this interview probably don't have labels for these kinds of roles, right? What might help with that dilemma? Ethnography. Actually following these poor four souls around and kind of observing them in other settings and seeing, you know, what their habits are. Maybe finding out something about whether Ruhani and Arvind have any sort of connection that might explain some of this, perhaps. Maybe Ruhani has certain habits outside of the setting. Maybe in Rajasthan, the whole issue of mother tongue is a bit more contested, problematic, less certain, let's say less certain than in places like Aligarh, right? Those are all possibilities. And, you know, we can certainly keep them in mind. All right, is the verb to describe or the noun description sufficient to understand what is being accomplished in the interview? In fact, what is being accomplished in the interview? What is being accomplished? Ruhani is pontificating. Is that too strong of a word? Right? She is giving Arvind some helpful life guidance. Is that a little softer? And Praji is kind of at a distance, trying to manage what's going on. Does that sound like an interview? Certainly is a description of mother tongue, what is happening here. If we say that, are we very good anthropologists? I mean, that is one description of what's happening here. But are we very good anthropologists if we make that assertion?
I think they are discussing how they perceive mother tongue. Because at a point, Arvind does call Marwadi as my dialect.
Yes.
So he does own it in a way. So what we gauge from his response is that the idea of mother tongue is complicated even for him, even though he has constantly maintained that Hindi is my mother tongue.
You are such a close reader. That is, what about this word dialect? My dialect.
Yes, exactly. So that also complicates whether he is considering Marwadi as a dialect of Hindi itself, or is he aware that Rajasthani has many dialects? And
Yes.
so is
Another
he
question.
specifying that Marwadi is my dialect because I come from the Marwad region of Rajasthan? Essentially, what happens historically also, Marwad or Marwadi as a category for people and language has been used for the whole of Rajasthan as well.
Yes.
So this is confusing for me also. What does he mean by calling Marwadi just a dialect, not even a language?
And is it possible by what you've said, that Ruhani has the idea that Marwari is the mother tongue of all Rajasthanis,
Absolutely.
and he has a much more nuanced idea about this.
Yes.
Beautiful.
And also, if we talk about location, Jaipur is a city, and most of the people do speak Hindi there. But then you will have a particular dialect that is. I live in Jaipur, but I do not speak that dialect. I speak my Shekhawati dialect. So, and therefore, in Jaipur, you will find that people from all areas of Rajasthan have lived for generations or keep migrating to. So, Jaipur as a place will have the speakers of many dialects of Rajasthani. So he's also kind of making a point that in Jaipur, basically people speak Hindi because I grew up there, so I speak Hindi.
Beautiful. A lot happening here. Absolutely. Cool. And could we get into gender? Or do we even want to touch it? Let's not touch it. What's that? The question, I've always loved the joke. At conferences, everyone's presented, and the kind of question that can always be asked, no matter what the papers were actually about. What about gender? Yes. Yes. That's part of what makes the joke work. Absolutely. And here is gender quite complicated. Quite complicated. In ways that we probably don't know about from the transcript itself. We need ethnography. No, not at all.
Yes, her interruption comes with that sort of a comfort. If they are friends, this seems like a conversation that they've already had.
Yes.
But this small snippet of conversations reveals about their dynamics quite a lot.
Yes. In other words, we suspect the interview itself is not creating the relationships between these speakers.
Correct.
Yes.
And we know Raji is a PhD student. So Raji is somebody with senior to them, right? And they are the same year in the same program.
Yeah. And that's all we know, thank God.
That's all we know.
Joking.
We don't want to know more. But we can sound something.
All right, that's basically what I have to say. What time is it? How are we doing? Is that, are we out of time?
I think when such ethnographic interviews are conducted, oftentimes, I mean, I did a very amateur kind of thing.
That's
back
okay.
for a project. So obviously the interviewer comes with certain predispositions as well. So the question formation itself is often very biased. And then some interviews are very satisfactory. It feels very satisfactory afterwards. And some interviews are just like, oh my God, why did I approach this person? And it turns out that oftentimes it is because we want their answers to fit the narrative that we already have, which is also backed by certain academic theorizations. And when it deviates from that, it complicates the work, and therefore it's very unsatisfactory and very complicated. So,
Lovely, lovely.
and the follow-up questions are also that the interviewer or anyone might ask also is part of this whole bias or complications of
Yes.
one's own.
My best, what I consider, you said interviews sometimes feel very satisfying. My very best interview at the field started with me asking a question, and this much older woman than I was, she was free to say this to me. She said, "Ye sawal to bakwas hai." And this question is bullshit. And then she proceeded to talk about what she wanted to talk about, and it was by far the most. I had to switch tapes. I turned the tape once. She really wanted to talk. So the context is she's visiting her sister who's very sick. She's visiting from Rewa to Banaras and desperately lonely and wants just to talk. And happened to be a government school teacher in biology in ninth level. And I just, it was an amazing discussion, and then, you know, formed a friendship. But she began by saying, "Your question is bullshit." And it was quite lovely. The worst experience of my entire field work, other than, you know, inside my field work, not outside, worst experience was when I came to the school. Here's a little anecdote about interviewing. When I came to the first school that I worked in a bunch. The principal said, "Oh, you're here for research, come tomorrow." I said, "Thanks, amazing." I went home, I thought, can this be this easy? I showed up in the morning and there was a velvet curtain. She said, "Step into the curtain." I stepped in and there is literally a shaking child. And I said, "What is this?" And she said, "Ask your questions. You have your machine, I see, turn it on, ask your questions." So I said, "What is your name?" "What do you study?" Sweat is just like literally shaking. I felt like I was torturing this person. She said, an arm reached into the curtain, she yanked the child out and said, "Why have you said nothing? Go back to the class." Then she brought another child in and said, "Ask your question. Maybe this one will talk." All of this is in Hindi. So I said, "What's your name?" I think 2 students out of 40 actually said something. They were so terrified. This was out of first grade. You know, they're really young kids who are not very used to 26-year-old skinny Americans, white Americans, just especially boys waltzing into a girls' school, asking all these questions. Mixed, I mean, a few boys, but mostly girls. So, yeah. We have to remember that, And it's not just that interviews won't go the way that we want. It's not just that interviews are a weird speech, they are a weird speech event that somehow have had enormous salience in our media saturated world. It's that we really need to look at what's happening in a transcript, what's happening in an ethnographic surround, and try to make sense of the interplay of the fact that this whole speech event and what it means and what it's supposed to do is widely circulating, and then what actually happens in it. And sometimes the answer is not nothing. These kids were terrified. That's something. I mean, something was happening. Their silence was not just nothing. It was booming, right? Then 2 weeks later, one of them ran up to me on the playground and said, "You shouldn't smoke." I had the pack of cigarettes and that's how we started. All right, you guys, should we move on to the next lecture? Or take a break? Really? I'm teasing. Oh, shoot. All right, let's take a break. 10 minutes, 15, 10 or 10 minutes, 11:30, and we'll continue.